Hi, my name is Dallas Mount with the University of Wyoming Cooperative Extension Service.
And I'm Rachel Mina.
Today we're going to discuss how to know when it's time to move your animals from one pasture to the next.
We're going to be discussing moderate grazing, heavy grazing, and light grazing, and maybe what those look like.
When it's time to move your animals from one pasture to the next, you really want to have grazed that pasture at a moderate level. So what does moderate grazing look like? We're going to show you.
So as you can see behind Dallas and I, this pasture has experienced some heavy grazing. So when we're looking at heavy grazing, what we really want to do is dig a little deeper, look a little bit closer at your actual grasses that have been grazed.
So as we look down at this pasture where we're standing here, we want to ask ourselves how many of the plants that we're looking at have been grazed this year. Is it just a few? Is it half of them? Or is it the majority of the plants? Well, in this situation, obviously, the majority of the plants have been grazed. And then the next question we want to ask is, well, how severely have they been grazed? Have the animals eaten most of this year's growth? Only a little bit, or have they barely touched it? Well, again, in this situation, most of this year's plant growth has been eaten almost to ground level. So this is definitely heavy grazing.
And it's not uncommon to see heavy grazing take place around a watering facility or a tree area, someplace where your livestock like to hang out and loaf for a time period. So this isn't uncommon, and areas that you should check on a regular basis for heavy grazing are those more desirable places for animals to hang out.
If you do have a pasture that's seen heavy grazing one year, some things to consider for follow-up management would be a deferment of grazing the next year, especially in the spring months, until those plants that you're trying to manage for, generally the cool season plants, have had an opportunity to complete their life cycle and put out a seed head. And you can either come in later that summer and graze, or graze after killing frost that winter, and it'll help that pasture recover from heavy grazing the prior year.
Now that we've looked at a heavy grazing situation, why don't we move on and take a look at what a moderate type graze situation might look like.
Sounds good. So now we're standing in an area that's seen moderate grazing. So we see some plants that have seen almost no utilization on them, and other plants that have seen pretty good utilization. And then we see quite a few plants that have seen some bites taken out of them, but they sure haven't been bitten down to the ground.
Moderate grazing usually encompasses about 40 to 60% utilization by the animals. So that's a way to, in your mind, gauge, does this look about 40 to 60%? You're probably in that moderate category.
A lot of folks have heard the term graze half, leave half. Well, if we're taking 50% and leaving 50%, then that's what we're doing. We're grazing moderately.
One thing to also consider is not only the grazing done by your livestock, but wildlife as well. If you're in an area that's heavily impacted by wildlife, you may only be able to take about 35–40%, depending on your wildlife herds that come through that area. So you definitely want to take half and leave half of that, and that's encompassing both wildlife use and livestock use as well.
So again, this is kind of what we're targeting. This is moderate grazing.
So now we're in a pasture that has experienced some light grazing.
So this part of the pasture is further removed from the water tank. As we look at these plants, there's a lot of plants that have not been grazed at all, and there's some plants that have seen just a little bit of grazing on them. So really this area has seen light grazing. Another thing to do is look across the fence line here at an area that's seen almost no grazing and compare the two. There's very little difference between across the fence and in the pasture where the animals have access to graze it.
Fence line contrasts are a great way to kind of gauge yourself as where you're at versus no grazing versus grazing.
Sometimes even without a fence line you can find areas where animals don't graze. Maybe it's in a prickly pear patch where there's cactus, where there's some yucca around, or where maybe some terrain features make it inaccessible to the animals. So light grazing really benefits those types of the plants that aren't being grazed. If you're managing for productive grasses that are going to continue to produce, sometimes you don't want to just avoid grazing entirely. Those grasses can become tall, dormant, and decadent, and really not be the best health for your pasture. So I think moderate grazing overall is probably a good thing to shoot for.
Yeah, like Dallas said, a thing to keep in mind is not grazing your pastures at all can be as detrimental as overgrazing your pastures.
So to summarize, we've looked at areas that have seen heavy grazing, moderate grazing, and light grazing. Well, there's a problem when you do this on a landscape scale. Where do you take the measurement? Do you look at the water tank and say, well, it's heavy grazing, it's time to move? Or do you go to the far corner of the pasture that sees light grazing and say, I better stay there longer?
I think a good rule of thumb is to pick an area that's representative of your pasture. Obviously, you can probably section this pasture off a little bit the places by the tank are more utilized than the places away from the tank, or those loafing areas for livestock. But if you can find an area that's fairly representative of your pasture, I think that's going to give you the best reading of your overall grazing pressure.
If you do have some areas that are really having a hard time getting the animals to go out to, it's probably an indication you need to split your pasture up into a smaller size, concentrate those animals a little bit more, limit their selectivity, and you'll even out the utilization in that pasture. So hopefully we've given you some ideas about how to know when it's time to move your animals. Remember, grazing intensity is just one part of the whole equation of intensity, opportunity, and frequency of grazing, and how that impacts the health of these plants that we're looking at. So from the University of Wyoming Cooperative Extension Service, I'm Dallas Mount.
And I'm Rachel Mealer.